Welcome to Between Two Chairs, Demystifying Commercial Real Estate, the podcast that brings you the latest insights and trends on the South Florida commercial real estate market, with your hosts, Fernando Arencibia Jr. and Jennifer Woolman. In each episode, we dive into the world of commercial real estate and break down complex concepts to make them accessible for everyone. Whether you're a real estate professional, a curious investor, or just interested in the South Florida market in general, Between Two Chairs is the podcast for you. So pull up a chair and join us.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Between Two Chairs. My name is Fernando Arencibia Jr., and with me, as always, is the very environmentally conscientious, that is Jennifer Woolman. Jennifer, say hi.
Hi, it is my background, so this is right up my alley.
Well, I didn't know that. You didn't say anything about that before.
No. It's been a long time. So, are you a commercial investor or aspiring to be one? If you are, I think that this is going to be a really interesting episode for you, because if you invest in commercial real estate at some point or another during your purchase or your sale, you're going to come across environmental assessments and phase 1 and phase 2. And we are very lucky today to be interviewing Nicholas Moran, founder and CEO of Moran Rocks, an environmental and consulting firm focused on Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami-Dade counties. He does work throughout the state, but we're focusing on those 3 counties because that's where we do business. And in addition to doing environmental site assessments, they also can help with stormwater services, and you would be surprised if you are new to development and operations in South Florida, especially if you have an industrial facility, you might need his stormwater services. So Nicholas, thank you so much for joining us today and helping our listeners understand more about the environmental issues that arise in commercial real estate transactions here in South Florida.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yes, of course. Tell us a little bit about yourself, a bit about where you grew up, how you got to where you are today.
I grew up in Miami Beach, went to Miami Beach Senior High. I went to FSU for college. I have a degree in geology. That's what I studied at FSU. And then I started working at Shaw Environmental, and we did all kinds of work across the state. And I've done all kinds of work. I've done air quality assessments. I've done assessments of tritium exit signs across California and Tennessee. But my day-to-day stuff was phase 1 and phase 2 environmental assessments for 8 years. And then after that, I joined Miami-Dade County, and I worked at Miami-Dade County. We funded with state funds the cleanup of gas stations and other retail petroleum facilities that are covered under the petroleum restoration program. So we held the purse strings, made sure they were doing a good job, and scoped the work out for them, make sure they were meeting the scope. And then now I'm doing my own business, helping the private sector.
I love that. I love that combination where you have the regulation background, right, working for the county, as well as you being an environmental consultant, because I think that probably gives you a much wider perspective as to what governments are looking for, and maybe help point out additional issues that just having that knowledge as a past regulator that you can share with your clients. So can you go over a little bit, just kind of the process, start with maybe transaction screen assessments and when those are used versus a phase 1 and a phase 2, and maybe for listeners who haven't done commercial real estate before, just do a brief overview of what a site assessment is and when somebody should be doing one.
Sure. So what you need to do a phase 1 environmental assessment if you care to have CERCLA liability protection. So I would think that most people would want that kind of liability protection. It's called the innocent landowner defense. Essentially, you go and you look into the history of the property before you purchase it. You do your due diligence, and if you've done it correctly according to the standards, the all appropriate inquiry standards, then you have a certain level of liability protection. You can say, well, I did my due diligence. And you can't be held to the same level of responsibility as somebody who just willy-nilly purchases, a former Indian burial ground, or as a joke. Not really,
Yeah.
but
that happens here too, a lot in South Florida, by the way.
Yeah,
for sure.
But so, not referencing poltergeist, but in other things, people have built on toxic waste dumps in the past, and this is how this rule came into place. Up in New York, somebody built on a toxic waste dump, and people were getting sick. And then the builder is like, well, I can't afford to relocate everyone and buy everyone new houses. And the federal government got involved and they made this rule. So you don't want to be in the position of that builder, being held responsible for this contaminated property that you built on. So you need to look into it first.
So let me just clarify real quick for our listeners, because we are about demystifying real estate. The CERCLA that Nick referenced is Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. It's from the 1980s, and it is more formally known as the Superfund Act, or anything related to Superfund. So thank you so much, Nick.
So basically, I would recommend to anyone who is planning to invest millions of dollars in a property to spend a few thousand to determine whether or not they want to keep that money. It's fundamentally asset protection.
It makes sense. And would you educate our audience on, let's go step by step. What constitutes a phase one environmental assessment?
So phase one environmental assessments must meet all appropriate inquiries, and that's defined in the CERCLA standard. And then all appropriate inquiries is itself sort of undefined in a way, and they say, well, to meet all appropriate inquiries, use the ASTM standard. So there's an ASTM standard 1527, I think it is. And you use that standard, and basically that standard gives you instructions on what to do. The American Society for Testing and Materials. So they make lots of standards, and that standard is respected in the United States and Canada, I believe.
Yeah. So what is, from a practical side, what does that standard constitute? And by the way, I love the name of your company. Moran Rocks is just fantastic. Great name. I love it. I'll never forget it. And so when your company gets hired to do an environmental assessment at phase one, following those, guidelines that you just mentioned, what does that constitute? I understand that there's a questionnaire to the owner, for example. Speak on that a little bit.
So you say, oh, I want a phase one environmental assessment. Okay, so what we do is we send a questionnaire to the purchaser, the person who's interested in buying the property. We send a questionnaire to the owner or the owner's representative, basically asking what they know about the history of the property. That's part of the interviews portion of the assessment. We interview people who might have relevant information. You can interview neighbors of the property. We do reach out to regulators if there's information about the property that the regulators could provide or shed light on. And so that's the interview portion. So you interview the owner, you interview the person who's purchasing the property, because presumably they may have some information. And oftentimes they'll say, well, I don't know anything. That's why I'm hiring you. It's like, that's fine. Just write that down. That's, for the purposes of the report. And then we do historical documents review. We go to the regulatory agencies and we ask, are there any documents on this property? Go to the fire department, go to the environmental department, building department. The building department might have information about old buried tanks that are on the site that nobody else knows about. What's funny is that, old buried tanks will show up in plans, but they won't show up in the environmental regulatory database because it happened before the environmental regulatory database was even formed.
Wow.
Miami Beach is actually full of these old fuel tanks, fuel oil tanks that nobody knows about, essentially, until you go and do a phase one. And you can actually find them by looking at little, they have little vents that run along the side of a building, because the fuel oil tank is right there on the side, and they have a vent that comes up, or sometimes it's just a small little, looks like a mushroom cap or something. And it's not anywhere else, but you can see it there, clear as day. So that takes me to the next step, which is you actually do a site visit. So after you've done the historical file review, including historical aerial photographs to see was there once built a gas station, or was there dumping on site, or could you see that the land was once cleared? That might indicate that it was used previously. So then you do a site visit and you see what are they doing there right now. And if you're just purchasing a apartment building or something like that, you're going to be looking at how are they storing their pool chemicals, where are they keeping the gasoline for the lawnmower, things like that. If there's elevators, you'll look and see that there's oil reservoirs that are included in as part of the elevator. You want to make sure that those aren't leaking. So you look for sources of contamination that could affect the soil and groundwater, because ultimately that stuff will need to be cleaned up. Or the cost of that cleanup needs to be included in your understanding of the value of that property. So let's say we have historical reports, we have interviews, we have the site visit itself.
Well, and you've been talking a lot about oil and gas stations and stuff like that. And yes, you might find a place that maybe was agricultural and had oil tanks.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Had oil tanks buried, or pesticides or fertilizers, but much more commonly, I think, and there is a case down in Pinecrest, Florida, something as simple as a shopping center, right? You might think, oh, well, it's a shopping center. It's never been a gas station. And it's been a shopping center since I can remember it. But you don't know if there was a user on there, such as a dry cleaner, decades and decades and decades ago, that contaminated the groundwater or the soil.
Or
and there is
printing presses.
Or printing presses. What other things do you look for? Like, so printing press, dry cleaner in a retail center.
Yeah, printing press, dry cleaner, auto repair, historical dumping. And I think that you do need to take into consideration that even though you may not have recent memory of there being a petroleum facility, there could have been a buried tank there at some point in the past for fuel oil or mineral oil or something like this. People, they just weren't concerned about that sort of thing. They use their property as they need to use it. And just regular operations, like, you could find out through your historical, or you could find out through your interviews that, let's say, a hotel, at the end of doing all of their washing and cleaning, took their wastewater and dumped it into a pit in the back. And if you've got 30 years of dumping wastewater into a pit, you're going to have contamination, and you're going to want to know about that. So
yeah, this is really interesting, because I'm sure that's part of your site visit is to look at the properties that are abutting the subject property,
yes,
right? To
yes.
see where, yeah.
People, that's another thing. Maybe some people who are sophisticated or they're knowledgeable about their own industry. If a dry cleaner is going to buy a dry cleaner, they may think that they don't need a phase one. But, the neighboring property could be affecting the value of your property, and you're not taking that into account.
So let me ask you, what is the threshold that would trigger a phase two? If you go into the site visit and you see some of those faults, right? Like maybe they're not storing the oil correctly. There's a leakage in the elevator system, for example. I'm just trying to ask if the threshold is low, meaning that little things like that can trigger a phase two, or should trigger a phase two, rather. Or is there a larger threshold that would trigger a phase two?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a term in the industry called de minimis conditions. And one that comes to mind immediately is if you go to a parking lot, you'll often see oil stains on top of the parking spaces. And that would be a de minimis condition. And frankly, how to define a de minimis condition would this come under regulatory enforcement? So are the regulators coming out and saying, oh my God, you have a release here, you need to assess this and remediate this? If the answer is no, then it's a de minimis condition. If you spilled some gasoline while you were filling your lawnmower and you dug it up and threw it in the trash, that's a de minimis condition. DERM is not going to come and enforce you on that. But that you rephrased your question, and I like that, because you asked, should something, rather than what forces it to go from a phase one to a phase two. Should something force something to go from a phase one to a phase two? In my mind, it just depends what's your risk tolerance, and you have to know that. So again, I think that some people just choose to ignore the risk, and that's not good. And in those cases, I would say you should do a phase two, or you should consider a different property if you don't like the idea of finding contamination here. If contamination scares you, and I told you that there's a recognized environmental condition, it's gone beyond de minimis, and you need to investigate this. If that scares you, maybe you should call the deal off. But, that's up to you. The one thing that I've learned is that it's not my job to say whether or not something is a good deal or a bad deal. I don't shut deals down. I provide information. That's what I want to do. I want to give the user information. Well, I think this might be an issue. You should probably investigate this, and we can install a soil boring here and a groundwater sample there and give you a better idea of what's going on the property.
To your point, this is just part of the due diligence process. It's right. Gathering information. And again, just like a regular property inspection, right? I mean, a bad roof isn't necessarily going to kill a deal, but as a buyer, you're going to know. And there are ways to remediate or do further testing if something is found in a phase two that might give you pause, right? And
yeah.
Miami has a fair number of Superfund sites and brownfields. In Miami, I'm talking about Southeast Florida. To Nicholas's point, this is asset protection before you go in. You mentioned on his website, and we will have his website on our show notes. He's got a great blog that talks about different court cases, and he breaks down those court cases in terms of like key takeaways, even if they aren't in Miami-Dade County. But one of them was how the phase one, to protect the buyer, how the phase one is written and who it's written for. Right? So can you tell us a little bit about the importance of that for meeting the innocent buyer qualifications if the bank is the one doing the phase one versus the buyer, or the phase two versus the buyer? And again, this isn't legal advice, guys. This is yeah. I'm doing our
not legal advice. Yeah, I'm not a lawyer. I don't even pretend to be one.
So this isn't legal advice. It's his insights. Yeah. It's our insights. And it's just things that in his experience, like in our experience, to look out for. Because just like a property inspection, the property inspection is good for the person who orders the property inspection. So if you buy somebody else's property inspection, there could be an issue there. Same thing, I think, with who orders the phase 1 and 2. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So in my experience, the phase 1 is a more standardized document, although at the same time you can ask for extra due diligence here or there, or you can add add-ons like asking for an asbestos assessment or mold or whatever. So it is a tailored document in the end, and when we produce the document, we say who may rely on it in the report itself. So this is for this company, this is for this company, and that company that's associated with this company. And later on, if that company wants to be able to pass that on to somebody else, they can reach back out to us and say, can you provide a reliance letter saying that the company that we're handing this to can rely on this information, and we can do that. But it is tailored for the individual and their needs. And I think the phase 2 is even more so, because this gets back to what is the user's risk tolerance. Again, if you know that you have contaminated facilities, and what you're really looking for is to understand how badly contaminated is this? Does this meet our internal threshold of, is this too contaminated, or are there too many cooks in the kitchen, essentially, that there's various interests? Like, for example, a big problem when your property is contaminated is if the contamination crosses boundaries into the neighboring property. You don't want to be buying a property that's contaminated from a neighboring property, nor do you really want to deal with the headache of having a property that's contaminating another property, if you can help it. I mean, you price all that in. To get back to your question, how tailored
the report needs to be to protect the buyer. Because if it's a bank who orders a phase 1, and I think you covered that when you spoke about the reliance letter and who's allowed to utilize to say that, yes, I was informed and this is the report that I relied on to make my purchase. So if contamination comes up later, they're at least covered. Whereas if they're not mentioned in the report, or they don't have a reliance letter, then they could be held.
Right, because they didn't do their due diligence.
Right.
Exactly.
They just picked up something off the street, in other words. Yeah. So it's just a matter of the banks are probably doing this in a more cookie cutter format. They have their policies that are broad across that asset class, so to speak. They may have specific requirements for multi-tenant housing that they have different for regulated industries like dry cleaners or gas stations, whereas you as the buyer, you have your specific concerns. You say, look, I don't want a lick of contamination. If you smell anything, you tell me. And that's a value to that person, but other people have a different risk tolerance.
For sure.
And it may boil down to, if you have information that you're working in a particular jurisdiction that's extremely nitpicky, you will say, my tolerance for suspected contamination, or my tolerance for real identified contamination, is very small in Miami-Dade County, but in Tampa it's going to be okay. You have to make those decisions.
Nick, you're hitting all the right points, because I remember working on a deal right on Okeechobee Road, and basically it was an old gas station 30 years before. There was contamination. The contamination was crossing a boundary. It just so happened that it was crossing the boundary into Okeechobee Road. And so basically, in order to have more of a risk tolerance, to your point, is basically FDOT just created a memorandum of understanding that they understood that there was some contamination that was crossing that border, but that they weren't planning on doing any development there, right? It's always going to be a road, right? And so, for them, it wasn't a big deal. And so, the buyers felt good about understanding that, okay, I'm not affecting anybody else. I know I'm not going to add any more contamination. And really the recommendation from a phase 3 was really just to keep monitoring, just have the monitoring of it. So, really interesting. Now, to a lot of our buyers, when they hear phase 2, there's two things that they think about. Number one is cost, and number two is time. And I think, they're related, right? And so, I don't really want to talk about cost, because I think it's the cost of doing business, and it's an important investment that you're making in your evaluation of the property. But talk about timeline. How long does it usually take for you to complete, on average? I'm sure that it's very site specific, but on average, how long does it take to do a true testing and an understanding to have lab results back and everything, and really have a phase 2 completed?
Do the entire timeline, because how long it takes to go to a phase 1 and how long it would take to finalize the phase 2 if it's required, because that's important when you're negotiating due diligence timeframes, especially since sellers down here want you, a 15-day due diligence period.
Right.
If you can do the whole timeline from start to finish and maybe additional monitoring.
Yeah, there's definitely a push for everything to happen immediately. I'd love to get your insight on that, why everything is in such a rush.
Easy, time kills deals.
Yeah, well, they drag their feet when it comes to me. So they'll contact me, and then a month later they want it in 10 days.
Yeah.
So
true.
But I would say that phase 1's a typical turnaround time is 3 weeks, and we can do a 10-day turnaround time and less for a rush fee. And if you have a relationship with us, we can work with you. But if we're getting a call off the street while we have other work going on, we need to stick to our timelines. Make sure that we're giving you the best deal. Make sure that we're walking into this completely aware and not cutting any corners. So I would say 2.5, 3 weeks for phase 1. The results you'll have RECs, which are recognized environmental conditions, and that will essentially lead to the scoping of a phase 2. And a phase 2 typically is a one-shot deal. We don't go back and assess further. Unless somebody would ask for that, but there's no requirement. I think that if you found contamination to such an extent that you need to assess it further, that probably would kill a deal, or they would purchase it and then continue the assessment later on. But that itself requires scheduling a driller, which can take 3 weeks, a month, depending on the driller's timeline. And then you would go and do your soil and groundwater samples. The groundwater samples may need to be taken 1 to 2 days after the wells are installed. And then the lab will get their hands on the samples, and that takes another 2 weeks, or maybe 2.5, 3 weeks, depending on what you're looking for. If you're looking for petroleum stuff, it'll happen in 2 weeks. If you're looking for more crazy stuff, it just takes longer. So it is a long process. I mean, you're looking at 2 months of research, of work. Time. It's mostly time. It's mostly waiting for people to make themselves available and for samples to get run and whatnot.
Perfect. And do you have any cautionary tales from either when you were a regulator or as a consultant on things that you found either before or after the fact during one of your site assessments? And no names, just anything is like a cautionary tale for buyers, what they might not be thinking about.
I have heard of people doing phase 1s on the wrong property.
Okay.
So it's one of the reasons why whenever anybody calls me, I ask for a map of the property, and I ask for the parcel number, not just the address, because you can get the address and it will be down the street. That happens plenty of times where you, for whatever reason, something's plotting 3 blocks away.
And that's mostly like vacant land?
Vacant land, that's
the number
that
one.
can happen. Or I've just had it where it was very funny for some reason. The address, one gas station, was showing up someplace else, and the other one, that was their address. I didn't understand it, but you encounter these things when you do it enough times. You end up thinking, oh, is it this vacant land? Is it that vacant land? Because they're catty corner, and they once were part of the same parcel, and then they've been split up. Or any number of things like that. So definitely you got to make sure that you're actually doing your investigation on the right property. And we've seen phase ones completed that were done on the wrong property. We did have a situation where, when I was a regulator, we had a situation where we drilled on the wrong property. And that was not like going to a whole nother property across the street. It was just we were like over the line. And so that became an issue. And when I say we, it's the royal we. I didn't do it. I want to make sure that I don't take credit for that.
Yeah, those invisible boundary lines are hard. I have a girlfriend that she was selling a property, and FPL had built something right on an area that she needed them to move it. And so they moved it, but they missed the boundary by a foot or something, and almost killed her deal because it was a line that they hadn't measured correctly. So I'm not surprised that that's one of your issues. So let's move on to stormwater, because that's a huge part here. It's a big deal throughout Florida just because of the amount of water that we have and how porous our limestone is, but it's especially a big deal in South Florida with Biscayne Bay. So talk a little bit about what you provide, who needs stormwater permits, how you help in that whole process if you're a contractor or a developer and you need stormwater affects you.
Yeah, so stormwater assessment, basically when you're a contractor, this comes up when you're building on a property. When you start to move dirt around and you obstruct or change the natural flow of water, or if you're dewatering, if you're digging down and you need to empty the pit of water, that water has to go somewhere. And so you apply for a permit to discharge that water to the storm sewer. And as part of that process, you need to monitor that to make sure that you're not discharging contaminated water, that you're not spreading contamination if you're working on a contaminated property. And just in general, if you're just doing surface level stuff, if you've ever driven by a construction site and you see they look like sausages that are over the storm drains.
Mm-hmm.
And those are there to prevent particulate from moving off-site into the storm drains. They don't want them to clog the storm drains. And if you see sometimes the entrance or exit of a construction site, you'll see like all the sand coming out and all the dust coming out onto the street and stuff like that. And that's an indication that they're not properly controlling their stormwater. The water is coming onto their property and washing this material out onto the street, and they're not properly controlling it. So they need to monitor that. They need to put into place a plan of how they're going to keep this material on site and control the flow of stormwater. And so we would create a SWIP, which is a plan for them. And then we would monitor periodically, where we were saying, okay, your storm drain is not clogged full of material. We can take pictures and stuff. It's not clogged full of material. We can replace these filters that go over the storm drains and stuff like that. Just sort of monitor the project as it's going along, making sure that you're doing what you need to do, and that you don't have Derm or somebody else come along and say, "Hey, you're not doing this right."
Yeah, I imagine those fines are pretty high. So I wanted to ask, like, what should people be looking for? Is there anything that gives you like an indication if you're looking at a site? I mean, you're not going to necessarily see anything underground, but
Right.
when you go and you walk a site, are there certain things that you look for? Like I told you, I have a background in environmental management. I go into restaurants, first thing I do is look up at the air vents.
Oh, what are we looking for in the air vents? Mold?
I don't want to see mold, mildew, dirt. I don't want to see gunk dripping from
Sure,
the
yeah.
Yeah. So that's where the flavor comes.
I've been in those restaurants in Miami that they have the drip, 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 ice cold water.
Right. So I'm just not sure what you look for when,
I look for
what you see.
This is funny. I didn't mention this in the part with the phase 1, but when you're doing a phase 1, you look for cuts in the asphalt. So, they'll build and then they'll run something later on, and they'll cut the asphalt, run it underneath, and then patch it, and you'll see a cut. You'll see a patch. And so you can see, if you go to an operating gas station, you obviously see the manhole covers that are above the tanks. That's an indication that there's a tank there. I mean, that's obvious in a place that's currently being used. In Miami-Dade, they have small manhole covers. They're like this big that are all around the petroleum storage system. And that means the tank plus all the piping plus the dispensers. That's the total petroleum storage system. So they'll have these manhole covers in each corner of the tank plus around the dispenser area. But if you start to see those further and further out, that means that there's been assessment. They at least had suspicion that there was contamination. And if you see more than what you see, like they call the ones that are around the tank area compliance wells. If you see another one and then another one, you for sure know that there was contamination that they were assessing it. And you can see also, you'll see small patches like this along that area, because usually the releases are going to be around the petroleum storage system. So you're going to see patches like that throughout the property where they're trying to figure out, is the soil and groundwater contaminated here? And basically if it's a patch like that and it's just patched and there's nothing there, that probably means that they either did a temporary well or they did just a soil boring. Whereas if you see the manhole covers, that's a permanent well, and they either intend to continue to monitor it, or they just chose to put a permanent well so that they can go back and check again later. And what you'll do with a phase 2 is you'll put in those holes like that, because you're going to do a temporary well. Typically, you're not going to install a permanent well, because the permanent wells you have to take out when you're finished with them. Eventually, they stay there for 30 years sometimes, but you eventually you want to take them out. But when you're putting in temporary wells, you just take them out when you're done collecting your samples. So that I would say, you see lots of cuts. You see a big rectangle. That's there was something there, or there is something there now. And so I would definitely say look for that. And then if you're looking at like a vacant property where there's nothing there and there's no asphalt and it's just grass or just sort of dusty road rock or whatever, look for stains, look for dumping, look for stains. Those are things that you can see right away. You're like, oh, something's happening here. It could be as simple as, if you're down in Homestead or whatever, people tend to like to just dump their truck's contents on the side of the road. Or it could be something a little bit more constant, where they've got their own little sewer sucking business and then they come over here and they're always dumping it in that one spot. So it could be one or the other.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember a site in Alapata that became kind of like the neighborhood dumping of old tires. And then the question is, well, if they're dumping tires, which are very visible, what else are they dumping here?
Right.
And so, definitely a huge red flag. What I think it's important about this conversation, I mean, a lot of things, and thank you so much for joining us. This has been very educational, is that there is no, hey, I didn't know this was happening here when it comes to buying commercial real estate. You have to do your due diligence. You have to do your environmental, because you can't claim, well, I just didn't know that this was contaminated or this has happened in the past. And so I think that there is a sense of a shared responsibility between the seller and the buyer that, hey, I got to tell you everything I know about the property. You got to do your own evaluation. And sometimes people do want to take shortcuts with the environmental at a great cost to them.
Yeah. Well, caveat emptor.
For sure.
All I can say to that is, I've heard people bellyache and complain. And, if you're in the commercial real estate business, this is your job. Like, you can't come along and buy properties and assume that everything is the best and that the seller has your best. I mean, you're certainly not treating like the seller has your best interest at heart when you're negotiating the sales price. And the seller is trying to get rid of a property. They don't care about the property anymore. They just want it off their hands. It's your property. You need to care about it. And when you find out that you're responsible, it's your property. Ultimately the buck stops with you. And you can complain about it, and you can complain that Durham is awful or FDP is awful and they're so terrible to you. You're the person who purchased the property. You're the person who should have looked into it. And I'm here to help. We're here to help.
And I think that that's a really good point to what we had discussed a little bit earlier. And I think that's probably the biggest red flag when you're a buyer. If the seller is pushing way too hard for a super, super fast due diligence period. And I'm not saying that they're hiding anything. A lot of times it's just they want to be done and move on. And maybe they did their environmental when they bought it, so they know it's fine, at least from the time that they bought it. But I think that should be a red flag to anybody. And I know in Miami's market, where things tend to move really fast, we go through these frenzies where everybody's buying and then it stops, and then there's a frenzy, and it's a crazy seller's market, and that's when buyers tend to get a little bit desperate. So I think Nicholas is here to tell you.
I also want to share, because
do not cut that.
Yeah, so we have brokers and agents that listen to the podcast. Mm-hmm. I've seen, just if I may share a couple tips, I have buyers who always add language that basically says, if an environmental one triggers an environmental as phase 2, then an additional time will be allotted for that due diligence. And on the flip side, I've had sellers who say, that's perfectly fine, but you need to prove to me that you ordered that phase 1 on day 1 of the due diligence period.
Right.
That it is ordered and paid for. So there's a balance there where you have two parties. Okay, fine. I want you to do your evaluation. I want you to do this, but I don't want you to dilly-dally, because I know how long that takes. So if you order it on the first day, you pay for it, it's ordered. Now we have a higher likelihood that you're going to come in with that time, or that within 3 weeks, I'm going to know if it's going to trigger that phase 2. So again, there are ways to negotiate this in the contract, and in a way that is amicable, in a way that makes sense for both parties, and both parties do their part to bring it to the finish line.
Yeah, I think there's so much due diligence and so many things that people do as part of the real estate process that they don't question. And then for some reason, this is like something that they've never heard of, and it's the most outrageous thing in the world that it should take more than 24 hours. And, just get used to the idea that you have professionals doing this work, and it's the same thing as an asbestos inspection. It's the same thing as a property condition assessment. It's helping you make your decision. It's like going to the dentist. You may not like it,
but you have to do it.
You got to do it
if you want to keep your teeth. So if you want to keep your property,
That's right.
Nicholas Moran of Moran Rocks is
Yeah.
your commercial environmental site assessment dentist.
There you go. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, Nicholas, thank you so much for joining us. And for everybody out there, thank you for pulling up a chair and joining us for this very special episode of Between Two Chairs. Until next time, say bye, Jennifer.
Bye, Jennifer.